Hello and welcome to CardioTube here at CRT 2020 in Washington, DC. I'm Toby Rogers and I have the great pleasure today of speaking with Isaac George. And we're going to be talking about transcaval, transcarotid, subclavian, retinal, you name it, alternate access in TAVR in 2020. So Isaac, welcome to CardioTube.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's just rewind a little bit. Not that many years ago, alternate access meant transapical, transaortic. Have we completely moved away from that? Is there still a role for transthoracic access, for TAVR?
There are a few cases every year that potentially have a role for a transthoracic approach, specifically transaortic or a transapical. The case in point are the young patients who have mantle radiation, who have horrible systemic vascular disease. Transfemoral is out, the subclavians are calcified, the carotids are calcified, the ascending aorta is a concentric pipe of calcium. Those patients may be best off with transapical approaches, and they do well because they're healthy otherwise individuals. The transaortic has become a little bit more of a little bit of a unicorn. You know, there's a very small number of patients that have only a transaortic approach and don't have other approaches. So that's become, I think, you know, the one that has died out. And transapical, it's very, very uncommon. It's just in those small group of patients with that specific anatomy.
And so, you know, the big sea change happened really after Partner 2 sort of showed that the transthoracic access in itself was sort of, you know, conferred worse outcomes. And so there's a rapid switch, and as a majority, people switched to something else they were comfortable with, which was subclavian access.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about, you know, subclavian percutaneous versus surgery. Where are we today?
You know, I think active centers have come to the conclusion that they need one good access site that's alternative. Whether it's subclavian, carotid, suprasternal, transcaval, all of them are good approaches. It really comes down to the specific operators being comfortable doing something well. The need for a third alternative access is relatively uncommon, so it really comes down to being good at whatever access you choose. Subclavian particularly has been very familiar to surgeons. It's familiar to interventionalists as well. It's a peripheral artery. It can be managed like a peripheral artery at the end of the day. Surgeons are comfortable because we do aortic surgery and we access the subclavian for arch surgery and things like that. So we have a lot of familiarity with it. Interventionalists likewise have an anatomic, you know, familiarity with it because it's pretty much like a femoral artery. And so the percutaneous approaches have been very successful. The one thing that's a little bit different with the subclavian is that it's a very fragile artery. When you handle it, it's much more fragile than probably the femoral artery to some extent. You have to have bailout options that are appropriate, and so you can do that percutaneously though for a lot of these people, and I think it's a nice approach. One of the drawbacks from the subclavian, in my mind, is that you still end up traversing the arch, and sometimes you get into angulation positions that are a lot more than you would consider from a transfemoral or even, let's say, a carotid or a suprasternal approach. So I think that's the downside. I'm not sure you're ever going to see a stroke or an embolic event rate that's as low as transfemoral using that approach because of that reason.
I mean, there has been some data out of TVT and out of a couple of other registries that does suggest there is a signal for increased stroke with subclavian. And certainly, you know, when you're talking complications of TAVR, stroke still is probably, you know, one of the most, if not the most devastating complication from the patient's point of view. So, right. You know, does that make you nervous about subclavian? Do you think it is just a technical?
You know, I think it's an anatomic limitation of the subclavian. I think the other thing that you can't discount is that because of the angulation, there may be some conduction payoff or, you know, increase in disturbance because of that positioning aspect, particularly for self-expanding valves when you're getting in very difficult angles and deploying. It's not necessarily my favorite alternative access approach, but I think because of its familiarity, it's a good access, and I think it's not wrong to use it per se. But I think it's going to be difficult for the technique to evolve to the point where it's truly like a transfemoral approach in its outcomes because of the anatomy.
Transcarotid. So it gives, some people feel very nervous about it. In some centers, it's become the predominant alternate access. In some countries, like France, it's the predominant alternate access. So what's your take on transcarotid as a surgeon?
The carotid, again, is another extension of a peripheral vessel. It happens to be in the neck, which is scary for a lot of people. It's scary for patients. And it's a site of atherosclerotic disease. We know that for so many years with vascular medicine. Carotids have to be free of disease, and that's an incredibly important point. You can't have disease along the carotid and hope that you're going to get away with it. And you probably get into situations where cross circulation is maybe unknown and may have some effect if you're completely occluding a carotid, which a lot of people do to prevent strokes, distally clamping the carotid before you take a catheter out or things like that. So I think, again, you're getting in a situation where you have a procedure that's extremely straightforward. The access surgically to a carotid is very nice. It's beautiful for surgeons. But you end up with a situation where some of the results may never get to the transfemoral approach for that anatomic limitation. And I think the exclusion rate for both subclavian and carotid will always be in the 10% range, or maybe even more for those reasons.
Suprasternal, I know that you're a fan.
We're a fan of suprasternal for a lot of reasons that the limitations for some of the other arteries are not there for suprasternal. It's a large vessel. It's a very large vessel. It's almost impossible to occlude it with the sheath sizes that we're using.
And just to be specific, you're talking innominate?
We're talking innominate, specifically the innominate artery accessed through a thyroid surgery incisions, transcervically essentially, and done again asleep with general anesthesia. We access the artery, it's deployed again retrograde, it's a pretty much straight shot. Our complication rate has been very low. The embolic rate has been extremely low. It's been lower than our transfemoral rate in our experience. We're selecting them out, but again, almost all of our alternative access over the last 4 years has been suprasternal, so I think we've done a good job with that. The conduction rate for our alternative access cases using suprasternal has been lower than our transfemoral. And I think it aims towards that signal that I was talking about, where the coaxiality that you get is probably unparalleled because it almost is in line with the annulus by a large degree. The one caveat, the one limitation with suprasternal is it's not a straightforward approach surgically until you have experience with it. And I think surgeons who do a lot of maybe minimally invasive or arch surgery would be more comfortable, but it does take a little bit of time to get used to the anatomy and be comfortable with where you are. The last the last issue with that is if you have a disastrous complication, very similar to a subclavian, that if it's a proximal complication and you need to operate, it becomes a little bit more difficult. You have to open the sternum and you have to do some advanced techniques, which can be very dangerous to a patient. We haven't had that happen yet, and we haven't seen it reported, but I'm sure it will happen.
At some point. And your site is also a big proponent of cerebroembolic protection devices. You can't put one of those in if you're doing a suprasternal or a right carotid, or you can maybe get away with the left subclavian. And that might argue towards a different approach, like transcable, for example, where you essentially are transfemoral and you can use, a sentinel device in the same way. Do you have any thoughts on, on that?
Yeah, no, I think transcarotid and using lithotripsy, which is kind of the new avenue out there, are potentially ways where you truly can get down to a transfemoral approach in a lot of different ways. In terms of those kinds of complications, you certainly will reduce stroke rates if you get a flawless transcable or a flawless lithotripsy type case. I think you end up adding other issues potentially. So long-term late issues of potential complications of a transcable, we're learning overall low, but in certain patients they may not tolerate it. The cost issue, the resource issue for transcable, the cost issue for using lithotripsy or shockwave, all of those things add up for lower margins. And then the time and experience required for certainly something like transcable is at least 20 to 50 cases, let's say.
So I mean, our TAVR devices are getting smaller and smaller. If you had to predict in the future, what percentage of patients are going to need alternate access for TAVR?
I mean, we're at 3% right now, and I think that's only going to go down. I think it'll remain at somewhere between 1% to 3%.
So a center that does 25 to 50 TAVRs a year, they're not going to be doing much alternate access.
No. And they probably shouldn't.
And should they be doing alternate access? One a year, one every 2 years?
Probably not. I mean, I think those are one of the key points for referral triggers. I think we'll have site-specific triggers for high-volume referrals, and I think that will be one of them. The highest risk complications for outcomes is clearly alternative access for many reasons, and I think those are an important thing to send to centers that do a lot of them.
And then finally, sort of stepping away from TAVR, it's interesting how transapical has come back in again because of mitral, and so it may well be that, yes, TAVR is not the big driver of alternate access, but it may well be that mitral interventions, large devices to treat pure aortic regurgitation, that there may be a need for it for other approaches. So these skills are things that we need to keep up, and that then brings us into the question of how do you maintain training and experience. And to me, again, I agree with you that probably means we have to concentrate these in centers of excellence, and rather than everyone doing a little bit of everything.
Yeah, there's no question that transapical is another experience-heavy technique, and kind of learning it on the fly is not what you want to do. That being said, I think we have a lot more tolerance and reserve nowadays because these devices are so much smaller than what we were doing in the early partner days, and so I think those results will get better. I think we have a 3-year window, maybe that's a little bit optimistic, before all of our devices will get transeptal, transfemoral, transvenous. So I do think that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're not going to do any transthoracic. And the number of non-femoral alternative access will probably get down to 1% to 2%. And I think we'll perfect what we're doing to some extent.
Isaac, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.